Hey guys, tonight we begin with a wooden stick with notches carved into it that will determine your life for the next 20 years, despite the fact that you won the argument, proved your innocence, and convinced everyone present that you were right. This is about manorial court tallies in 14th century England, those quiet records that documented every judgment, every fine, every obligation, every debt, in marks that nobody could erase and few could read, but everyone had to live under. It's not about the drama of accusations or the spectacle of trials. It's about what happened after the shouting ended, when the clerk made marks in wood and parchment that outlasted memory, outlived witnesses, persisted across generations as evidence of debts you might not even remember incurring. And what that reveals about how quiet justice works, not through moments of judgment, but through decades of documentation, not through proving innocence, but through records that don't care about truth, only about what's written down. Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about bureaucracy as power, about how record-keeping shapes reality, about systems where documentation matters more than truth, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments whether you think our modern systems of credit scores and legal records are fundamentally different from this, or just medieval tallies with computers. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how documentation becomes control. Now settle in and let's discover what happens when notches in wood outlive your version of events.
The manor is Westfield in Somerset, and the year is 1348. England is about to be hit by the Black Death, but nobody knows that yet. They're just dealing with normal 14th century problems like harvest failures and taxes, and trying to navigate the complex web of obligations that tie peasants to manor lords and everyone to everyone else through debts and duties that get tracked in court records. The manorial court meets every 3 weeks, handles disputes, enforces rules, records everything. The clerk is a man named Edmund, who's held this position for 12 years. He's meticulous. Every judgment gets recorded twice, once in the court roll, parchment sheets sewn together that document the court's proceedings in Latin, and once on tally sticks, wooden rods with notches cut into them that represent specific amounts or obligations. The tally sticks are split down the middle. One half goes to the person who owes, one half stays with the court. When debt is paid, the pieces are matched and both are destroyed. Until then, the notches are permanent record that can't be argued away.
William Carpenter is 26 years old and has just been fined 6 pence for letting his pigs damage the common field. He definitely didn't let his pigs damage anything. His pigs were penned properly. Someone else's pigs, probably Thomas Fletcher's, did the damage. But Thomas accused William first, claimed he saw William's pigs in the field, brought 2 witnesses who sort of confirmed this, though their testimony was vague. William brought his own witnesses, who said his pigs were penned. The evidence was roughly equal. The reeve who presided couldn't determine truth definitively, so he split the difference, fined William 6 pence, fined Thomas 3 pence for failing to properly supervise his own animals. It's compromise. Neither party is satisfied, but both are equally dissatisfied, which the reeve considers justice.
William argues, points out the logical problems with the judgment. If his pigs were penned, which they were, which his witnesses confirmed, then he can't be responsible for field damage. The fine doesn't make sense. The reeve is unmoved. The court has ruled. The fine is 6 pence. Pay now or it goes on tally. William doesn't have 6 pence immediately available, so it goes on tally. Edmund the clerk takes a wooden stick, cuts 6 notches in it representing 6 pennies, splits the stick lengthwise, gives one half to William, keeps the other half in the court's collection. William now officially owes the manor 6 pence. The tally stick says so. Doesn't matter that he's innocent. Doesn't matter that his witnesses were credible. The record says he owes 6p. That's what matters.
William goes home furious. His wife Mary listens to him rant about injustice, about being fined for something he didn't do, about the Reeve being incompetent and the witnesses lying and the whole system being corrupt. Mary is more pragmatic. How long until you pay the 6p? William doesn't know. Maybe a few months, maybe longer. Depends on whether the harvest is good enough that he has spare grain to sell. Depends on whether he can pick up extra work. 6p doesn't sound like much, but for a peasant family it's significant. Several weeks of earnings. The tally stick sits on the shelf in their cottage, physical reminder of debt that needs paying. But also just one more obligation among dozens. William owes the manor labour services, owes his neighbour for borrowed tools, owes the miller for grinding grain. The 6p tally just joins the pile of things he owes that he'll get to eventually, when he can.
Except the tally doesn't forget. William forgets, gets busy with planting season, then harvest, then dealing with his sick child. Months pass, the 6p fades from immediate awareness. But 3 months later the court meets again. Edmund checks his records, sees that William's tally remains unpaid, adds a notation in the court roll. William Carpenter owes 6p plus 1 penny interest for 3 months overdue. Now William owes 7p. The interest compounds. The clerk doesn't need to notify William, doesn't need to remind him, just makes marks in parchment and wood that accumulate consequences whether William remembers them or not.
6 months after the original fine, William is summoned to court again. He's confused, hasn't done anything wrong recently. Shows up and learns he's being called for non-payment of debt. He owes 8p now, original 6 plus 2 pennies interest. The Reeve asks when he'll pay. William says he doesn't have it yet, had unexpected expenses, medical care for his child, repairs to his cottage. He'll pay when he can, but needs more time. The Reeve agrees to more time, but adds condition. Additional 2p penalty for extended non-payment. You now owe 10p. This goes on tally. Pay within 3 months or face seizure of goods. Edmund makes new notches. William goes home with updated tally stick that documents his increased debt.
Mary is less understanding this time. You were supposed to pay that. It was 6p. Now it's 10. How did you let it get this bad? William doesn't have good answers. He didn't let it get bad. It just accumulated. The obligations piled up. He paid other debts that seemed more urgent. The manor court debt sat there quietly, growing through interest and penalties while he dealt with everything else. That's how the system works. You forget about the tally because it's just notches in wood. But the notches remember, the parchment remembers, the court remembers, and they add consequences while you're busy living your life and forgetting about debts that the record never forgets.
9 months after the original fine, William still hasn't paid. He's tried, sold some eggs, did extra work for a neighbour, accumulated maybe 6p, but he also incurred new expenses, needs the money for next year's seed, can't give it to the manor because then he can't plant. The calculation is impossible. Every choice has costs. Paying the manor means not being able to do something else equally necessary. So he doesn't pay, and the tally keeps accumulating. Now he owes 14p, original 6 plus 8 pennies in interest and penalties. The amount has more than doubled while he's been trying unsuccessfully to pay it.
The court summons him again. This time the Reeve is less patient. William Carpenter, you owe 14p. You've had 9 months. The court has been generous with extensions. Either pay now or the court will seize goods equivalent to the debt. William panics. 14p worth of goods is significant. His best tools, possibly his plough, things he needs to work, things he can't replace. He begs for more time. explains his situation, the expenses, the impossible choices. The Reeve is unmoved, has heard this story hundreds of times. The tally doesn't care about your expenses. You owe 14 pence. The record is clear. Pay or face seizure.
William negotiates desperately, offers to pay in labour, additional workdays beyond his required service. The Reeve considers. Labour is valuable. Agrees that William can work off the debt at rate of 1 penny per day. 14 days of extra labour. William accepts. Has no choice. The alternative is losing tools that would make earning anything impossible. Edmund updates the records. The 14 pence debt is converted to 14-day labour obligation. William's tally now shows 14 marks representing workdays he owes. The parchment roll documents the conversion. William has traded one impossible obligation for a different one. Doesn't owe money anymore, owes time. 112 hours of labour that he has to fit around his own work and family obligations, and everything else demanding his attention.
William spends the next 3 months working those 14 days, 1 or 2 days per week given to the manor, on top of his regular required services. It's exhausting. He's working maybe 6 days per week total, no rest, no time for repairs on his own property or attention to his family. The debt gets paid through grinding labour that leaves him depleted, but it gets paid. After 3 months, Edmund marks the tally as satisfied, breaks both halves of the stick. The debt is cleared. William is free of this particular obligation, has learned a painful lesson about how court tallies work. They don't forget. They don't care about circumstances. They just accumulate consequences until you either pay or get crushed.
If you just felt that recognition of how documentation creates power separate from justice, of how records become more real than reality, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way bureaucracy works through persistent marks that outlive memory and truth. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want more of these explorations of how systems control through record keeping. Tell me in the comments about your experiences with debts or obligations that compounded while you were trying to handle them. 6 months after clearing his pig-damage debt, William is back in court. New accusation. He allegedly failed to maintain the boundary ditch between his land and his neighbours. The neighbour complains that water is flooding his field because William didn't clean the ditch properly. William argues he did clean it, that the flooding is from unusually heavy rain, that the neighbour is looking for someone to blame for natural disaster. The evidence is ambiguous. The ditch does need maintenance, but whether that's William's fault or just weather is unclear. The Reeve rules that William is partially responsible. Fine of 4 pence, plus he must complete the ditch maintenance within 2 weeks or face additional penalty.
William pays this one immediately. Doesn't have 4 pence, but borrows it. Goes into debt to a neighbour to pay the manor debt. The tally gets satisfied quickly. No accumulation, no interest, but he still ends up in debt. Just private debt now instead of court debt. Owes his neighbour 4 pence plus a favour. The system moves obligations around, but doesn't eliminate them. William is perpetually in debt to someone. That's normal. Most peasants are. The manor court tallies are just one layer of the obligation network that structures peasant life. Pay one debt, create another. The tallies might clear, but the underlying condition of owing never really ends.
Over the next 5 years, William appears in Manorial court maybe 15 times. Sometimes as plaintiff, bringing complaints, sometimes as defendant, facing accusations, sometimes just as witness. Most cases involve minor issues, property boundaries, annual trespass, failure to perform required services on time. The judgments are usually small fines, 3 pence, 6 pence, occasionally larger.
William pays some immediately, lets others go on tally, works them off through labour. The rhythm becomes familiar. Do something or fail to do something, get fined. Pay or don't pay, accumulate or clear debts. The court tallies document all of it, create permanent record of William's interactions with the justice system, build up picture of him as someone who's frequently in court, someone with multiple unpaid obligations at various times, someone the system has to keep tracking because he's not always compliant.
The documentation matters more than William realizes. Edmund the clerk maintains comprehensive records. Every time William appears in court, that appearance goes in the parchment roll. Every fine goes on tally, if not paid immediately. Even after tallies are satisfied and broken, Edmund makes note in the roll that the debt existed and was eventually cleared. The cumulative record shows William as someone with pattern of non-compliance, someone who frequently accumulates debts, someone the court has to monitor. This reputation is being built in writing, will outlive memory, will persist after witnesses die, will shape how future reeves and clerks see William based on what's written rather than what anyone remembers about the actual circumstances of individual cases.
William doesn't think about this accumulating documentary evidence. He's just living, trying to meet obligations, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, dealing with each court appearance as isolated incident. But Edmund is creating a narrative in the records, pattern that suggests William is problematic, that he requires oversight, that his promises to pay should be viewed skeptically because the record shows he often doesn't pay on time. The tally sticks and parchment rolls are building case against William more effectively than any individual accuser. They're documenting a pattern that becomes its own evidence, becomes the story about who William is according to the court system. That story will matter more than any specific truth about whether his pigs really damaged the field or whether he really failed to maintain the ditch. 3 years after the first pig damage fine, William applies to the court for permission to marry his daughter to a freeman from another village. The marriage would allow his daughter to escape serfdom, give her opportunities William never had. The application requires the reeve's approval. The reeve consults Edmund's records, sees that William has been in court frequently, has accumulated multiple debts, has required labour conversion twice, has pattern of non-compliance. The reeve denies the marriage application. Your daughter cannot marry outside the manor. Your family has demonstrated unreliability. We cannot lose labour from people who don't consistently meet obligations. William is devastated. His daughter's future is being determined by tally marks and parchment notations about debts from pig damage and ditch maintenance. The reeve doesn't remember those specific cases, didn't preside over half of them, but the records do. The documentation has created a version of William that's separate from who William actually is. A document itself that exists in marks and notches. That self is unreliable, frequently in debt, problematic. That document itself determines what real William can do, what his family can do, what opportunities they have or don't have. The tallies have outlived the truth of individual moments and created a cumulative truth that's more powerful than any single fact. William challenges the decision, argues that he's paid all his debts eventually, that the delays were due to circumstances beyond his control, that his overall record shows someone trying to meet obligations despite difficulty. The reeve is unmoved. The record shows frequent non-compliance. That's sufficient grounds for denial. Appeal to the Lord Steward if you disagree with this ruling. William can't afford to appeal. The process costs money he doesn't have, would require hiring someone to present his case, would involve risking antagonizing the reeve further. He accepts the denial. His daughter stays on the manor. Her life is shaped by notches in wood that documented debts her father incurred years ago for pigs he didn't let damage anything.
This is the power of manorial court tallies. They're not dramatic, not spectacular, not the stuff of stories about justice, just wooden sticks with marks, parchment sheets with Latin annotations. But they determine lives. They persist after memory fades. They create documentary reality that supersedes lived reality. They outlive loudest accusations, because loud accusations are just sounds that dissipate. The tallies are permanent. The records don't forget. The documentation becomes the truth that matters more than any truth you could prove in the moment. William won his argument about the pigs. His witnesses were credible, but the tally said he owed 6p. And that tally, through accumulation and interest and pattern over time, cost his daughter her freedom. That's quiet justice. Justice that operates through persistent marks that nobody can shout away.
William is 34 years old when he realizes fully how the system works. He's been in court dozens of times, has multiple tally marks behind him, some cleared, some still accumulating. He looks at Edmund, the clerk, one day and understands that this man, with his notches and parchment, has more power over William's life than the reeve who makes judgments. The reeve judges moments, Edmund documents patterns. The moments fade, the patterns persist. The documentation outlives everything. William can't fight the tallies, can't argue with notches in wood, can only try to minimize how often he appears in records and how quickly he clears obligations when they appear. That becomes his strategy. Stay out of court when possible. Pay debts immediately when impossible to avoid them. Don't let things accumulate, because accumulation creates the pattern that becomes your identity in the records. But staying out of court is almost impossible. The manor system requires constant interaction with authority. Labor services need accounting. Infractions need addressing. Disputes need resolving. William can be more careful, but can't avoid the system entirely. So he continues appearing in court, continues accumulating occasional fines, continues having his life documented by Edmund's careful notations. The tallies multiply, the parchment fills, the documentary record grows, and that record becomes the story of William Carpenter that will outlive William himself, that will be consulted by clerks decades from now who need to know about the Carpenter family's history of compliance or non-compliance, that will shape his children's opportunities and his grandchildren's status. The notches in wood and marks on parchment are writing William's future in ways no amount of actual good behavior can fully change. That's how quiet justice works, through documentation that persists, through records that create reality more permanent than memory, through tallies that outlive the loudest accusations, because accusations fade, but notches endure.
The accumulation of tallies creates surveillance system without surveillors. Edmund doesn't need to watch William constantly, just needs to record when William appears in court. The records do the watching. They accumulate evidence over time, build patterns, create profiles, enable predictions about who William is and how he'll behave, and whether he can be trusted. The system is elegant, doesn't require constant enforcement, just requires careful documentation and long institutional memory. The tallies are that memory. They don't forget, they don't forgive, they just mark and accumulate and persist, until William is defined less by his actions and more by his record, by the documented pattern of those actions as filtered through court judgments that may or may not have been fair, but are definitely written down. That's the power Edmund wields through his notches and parchment. Not the power to judge, the power to remember, the power to create permanent version of William that William can't edit or explain away or escape. The tallies are truth because they're written, because they persist,
Because they outlive everything else, including the actual truth of what happened when someone's pigs damaged some field somewhere in 1348.
The Black Death arrives in Westfield in October 1349. Within 3 months, half the manor's population is dead, including the reeve, including multiple witnesses to various court cases, including people who owed William money and people William owed. Memory dies with those people. Verbal agreements disappear. Personal knowledge of who said what to whom evaporates. But the court Tallies survive. Edmund survives. And the parchment rolls survive. The documentation persists while human memory is erased. That's when William understands fully what persistence means. What it means that records outlive people. What it means that his obligations exist independent of anyone remembering why they exist.
The new reeve is appointed 4 months after the plague passes. His name is Geoffrey. He's younger than the previous reeve, doesn't remember the specific circumstances of cases from 5 years ago, doesn't know William personally, beyond what the records say. The first thing Geoffrey does is inventory the court's documentation, consults with Edmund about outstanding tallies, discovers that William Carpenter has 3 active tallies totaling 12 pence. William doesn't remember these, or rather, he remembers incurring various fines, but thought some of them were cleared or forgotten in the chaos of plague death. They weren't forgotten. Edmund's records are meticulous. The tallies exist, independent of whether William remembers them. Geoffrey sends notification that William owes 12 pence. Please pay within 2 weeks or face penalties.
William is shocked. 12 pence? He doesn't have 12 pence. Most people don't after plague devastated the economy. Labour is valuable now because so many workers died. But cash is scarce. Goods are scarce. The manor is barely functioning. And Geoffrey is demanding payment of debts that predate the plague. Debts from a different world, when different people were alive to witness their creation. William goes to the court, argues that the circumstances have changed, that the plague should reset obligations, that demanding payment now is unreasonable, given what everyone's been through. Geoffrey listens, consults the tallies. The marks don't mention plague. They just show you owe 12 pence. Circumstances of the debt are irrelevant. You owe what the tally says you owe.
William tries different argument. Points out that half the people involved in the original cases are dead. Witnesses are dead. The previous reeve who made judgments is dead. How can debts be enforced when nobody remembers the circumstances except what's written? Geoffrey's response is simple. That's exactly why we have tallies. People die. Memory fails. The marks persist. That's their purpose, to outlive human uncertainty. You owe 12 pence because the tally says so. The fact that people died doesn't erase marks in wood.
William realizes he's arguing with a system that's designed specifically to survive exactly what he's using as defense. The tallies exist because memory is unreliable, because people die, because circumstances change. The whole point of documentation is to create obligation that persists regardless of human factors. Geoffrey isn't being unreasonable by the system's logic. He's implementing the system exactly as designed, using permanent records to enforce obligations that would otherwise be disputed or forgotten. William's arguments are futile because they're arguments against documentation existing at all. And documentation does exist, is sitting right there in Edmund's careful marks, is undeniable, is permanent, is truth, whether William likes it or not.
William negotiates labour conversion, works off the 12 pence over 4 months, doesn't have choice, can't pay cash, can only pay time. The post-plague labour shortage means Geoffrey is willing to accept labour because workers are valuable. But it's still 4 months of William's life going to debts he barely remembers incurring, under a system that survived everyone who could testify about whether those debts were even just. The Tallies won, outlived the plague, outlived the reeve, outlived witnesses, persisted through death and chaos and social disruption. That's their power. Not that they're just, but that they're permanent. Not that they're fair, but that they're documented. Not that they're right, but that they're written.
The post-plague manor operates differently than before. Labour is scarce. Peasants have negotiating power they didn't have before. Many leave their manors seeking better conditions elsewhere. The Lord of Westfield tries to prevent this, needs workers, can't function without them. He instructs Geoffrey to use the court tallies to prevent migration. Anyone who wants to leave must first clear all outstanding obligations, and the tallies show that almost everyone has outstanding obligations. Fines from years ago that accumulated interest, labour services that weren't perfectly fulfilled, ancient debts that predate living memory but exist in parchment. The records become chains, not metaphorical chains, actual legal obstacles to mobility. You can't leave until the tallies are clear, and the tallies are never fully clear, because the system is designed to keep people obligated.
William watches younger peasants try to leave. They apply for permission to seek work elsewhere. Geoffrey consults Edmund's records, discovers unpaid fines, ancient labour obligations, penalties that accumulated during plague chaos. Every applicant is told they can leave after clearing their tallies. Most can't. The deaths are too large, were allowed to accumulate too long. The documentation has trapped them as effectively as law or walls. The tallies are invisible prison. They don't prevent you from physically leaving, just make leaving illegal until you satisfy obligations recorded in marks that might be decades old, and certainly were never negotiated with idea that they'd become lifetime obstacles to freedom.
One young man named Robert challenges this system directly. He's 19. Most of his family died in the plague. He has opportunity to work for a merchant in another county, better wages, better life. But Geoffrey says he can't leave until he pays 8 pence, recorded in his father's tally. Robert's father died 2 years ago. Robert argues that his father's debts aren't his responsibility, that obligations don't transfer to children. Geoffrey disagrees. The debt was household debt. You're heir to the household. You inherit its obligations along with whatever property remains. The tally shows your family owes 8 pence. You represent your family. Pay or stay.
Robert argues that this is feudal tyranny, that records are being weaponized to prevent freedom of movement, that the manor is using documentation to maintain control that law doesn't actually give them. He's articulate, makes good points, has support from other young people frustrated by the system. For a moment, it seems like maybe the records can be challenged. Maybe documentation isn't absolute. Maybe the marks can be argued away when their application is obviously unjust. Geoffrey listens to all of this, then consults Edmund's tallies. The marks don't care about your arguments. 8 pence, pay or stay. If you leave without paying, you'll be declared outlaw. Any other manor you arrive at will be notified of your fugitive status. You'll be sent back. Better to pay and leave legally than flee and be hunted.
Robert tries to flee anyway, leaves in the night, makes it to another county, finds work with the merchant, thinks he's escaped. 3 months later, he's arrested. Geoffrey filed documentation with neighbouring manors, noting Robert as fugitive with unpaid tally. The merchant doesn't want legal trouble, turns Robert over to authorities. Robert is returned to Westfield. Now he owes the original 8 pence, plus 6 pence penalty for flight, plus 4 pence for administrative costs of recovery. 18 pence total, more than double the original debt. And he's now marked in the records as flight risk, someone who can't be trusted, someone who needs watching. Edmund adds detailed notation to the court roll about Robert's flight attempt. That notation will follow Robert forever, will be consulted whenever he requests anything, will shape how he's treated by every future reeve who reads the manor's records. Robert's one attempt to escape created documentary evidence that he's problematic. That evidence will outlive any memory of why he tried to leave, will persist as mark against him permanently.
If you're recognizing the pattern here, the way systems use documentation to create permanent truths that trump lived reality, that's exactly what we're exploring. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this plays out across generations, and share your thoughts about modern equivalent to this kind of documentary control. Credit scores, legal records, databases that remember everything while claiming objectivity.
William is asked to testify about Robert's character. The court is considering whether Robert should face additional punishment beyond the financial penalties, whether he should be marked officially as unreliable, whether restrictions should be placed on his future activities. William knows Robert, knows he's a good young man who made desperate choice, knows the original debt was questionable and the system is unjust. But William also knows that testifying in Robert's defence means going against Geoffrey and Edmund, means challenging the record-keeping system that has enormous power. William calculates his options, decides he can't afford to antagonize the people who control the documentation that defines his own life, testifies neutrally, doesn't defend Robert, but doesn't condemn him either, protects himself by refusing to challenge the system, even though he knows it's wrong.
Robert serves 18 months of labour to clear his 18 pence debt. By the time he's free, the merchant opportunity is gone. He stays in Westfield, broken by the system. The Tallies won again, outlived his attempt to escape, created documentary record that prevented freedom, added marks that will shape his future. The quiet justice of documentation proved more powerful than loud arguments about tyranny or rights or fairness. The marks don't care about justice. They just persist, and persistence is more powerful than any individual's attempt to resist.
The pattern repeats across the manor. People try to leave, get stopped by tallies, either pay impossible amounts or stay trapped. The documentation has created obligation network that's more effective than walls at containing people. The manor's population stabilizes, not because people want to stay, because the records won't let them leave. The tallies are invisible infrastructure, maintaining feudal control in a world where actual power structures are weakening. The plague broke traditional authority, killed the reeve, killed witnesses, killed the institutions of memory that sustained feudal order. But it didn't kill the parchment, didn't destroy the tallies. The documentation survived and compensated for the loss of human authority by becoming authority itself. The marks are law now, more reliable than judges, more permanent than reeves, more authoritative than lords, because they persist, because they don't die, because they're written.
Edmund understands this power he wields, doesn't abuse it dramatically, doesn't need to, just maintains records meticulously, makes marks carefully, preserves tallies properly. The documentation does the work, creates obligations, enforces them, prevents challenges. Edmund is more powerful than the reeve in some ways. Geoffrey makes judgments, but Edmund makes those judgments permanent, translates them into marks that outlive Geoffrey's authority. When Geoffrey eventually dies or retires, his successor will rely on Edmund's records to understand what obligations exist. Edmund's documentation will shape the new reeve's judgments, will tell him who's reliable and who's not, will create a version of every peasant that's based on accumulated marks rather than personal knowledge. Edmund is building permanent history of the manor that will outlive everyone currently living. That history will be consulted decades from now by people who know nothing except what Edmund wrote. That's quiet power. Power through documentation that persists.
William is 46 years old when he realizes he can never fully escape his own record. He's been trying to be more careful, pay obligations promptly, stay out of court. But the old marks remain. Edmund's records show decades of minor infractions, pattern of occasional non-compliance, multiple debt accumulations. Nothing terrible, just human. But when accumulated in documentation, it looks like lifetime of problems. William applies for permission to lease additional land, wants to expand his farming, has resources to make it work. Geoffrey consults Edmund's records, sees the pattern, decides William is too risky. Your record shows unreliability, multiple debts, frequent court appearances. I can't approve additional land lease for someone with your history. William's lived reality. He's become more responsible, pays debts consistently now, has good harvest record. Doesn't matter. The documentary history matters, and that history is accumulation of marks that can't be erased, that tells story about William that's different from who William is, but more permanent than who William is.
William tries to argue that recent record is better than old record, that he's changed, that old marks shouldn't determine current opportunities. Geoffrey is sympathetic but firm. I don't make decisions based on my personal impression. I make them based on documented history. Your documented history shows pattern I can't ignore, regardless of how you seem now. The marks don't lie. Except the marks do lie. Or rather, they don't lie, but they don't tell complete truth either. They tell narrow truth about court appearances, without context, about fines without explanation, about debts without accounting for circumstances that caused them. The marks are accurate but incomplete. Yet incomplete truth that's documented is more powerful than complete truth that exists only in memory or impression. William is trapped by his own record, by documentation that Edmund created years ago, marking moments that William barely remembers but that define him permanently, according to the court.
The system expands after plague. The manor needs more revenue. Population is smaller, so each remaining peasant must contribute more. Geoffrey increases court sessions, finds more violations, creates more opportunities for fines. The tallies multiply. Edmund's parchment fills with notations about infractions that would have been ignored before plague, but now need enforcement because the manor needs money. Every peasant acquires more marks, more documented obligations, more tallies that need paying. The documentation is being weaponized, used not just to record justice, but to create revenue through fines that get documented in permanent marks. The tallies aren't neutral records anymore. They're tools of extraction, mechanisms for converting peasant life into obligations that generate money for the lord.
William gets fined for not cleaning ditches properly, for not showing up to harvest labor on time, even though he was sick, for allowing his chickens to wander onto common land. The fines are petty. Each one is maybe 3 pence. But they accumulate. Within a year, William has 6 new tally marks, 18 pence in obligations. He pays some, lets others accumulate, can't keep up with the rate that new marks are being created. The system is generating tallies faster than they can be satisfied. That seems to be intentional. Keep everyone perpetually obligated. Keep everyone perpetually in debt. Use the documentation to maintain control through obligation that never ends, because marks keep multiplying faster than they can be erased. Other peasants experience the same pattern. Everyone has multiple tallies. Everyone owes something. The court rolls are fuller than they've ever been.
Edmund is working constantly, maintaining records, making marks, updating tallies, adding notations about who owes what to whom. The documentation has become full-time job. The manor now employs an assistant clerk because Edmund can't keep up alone. The expansion of record-keeping employs people while creating obligations for everyone it records. It's self-perpetuating system. More records mean more work, which means more employment, which means more people dependent on the system continuing. Edmund's livelihood depends on maintaining comprehensive documentation. He's incentivized to mark everything, miss nothing, create permanent record of every transaction and obligation and judgment. That thoroughness serves the manor's interests by ensuring nothing is forgotten. But it also creates a surveillance state where everything about a peasant life is documented and potentially used against them.
William stops trying to understand justice, just tries to minimize his marks, pay quickly when possible, avoid court when possible, accept that some obligations will accumulate because avoiding all of them is impossible. The goal shifts from being innocent to being less documented, from being right to having fewer marks. The system has taught him that justice and documentation are separate things. Justice is what happens in moment. Documentation is what persists, and what persists matters more. Better to be guilty and quickly pay to close the tally than to be innocent and fight the judgment, allowing the tally to accumulate. Better to accept small injustice immediately than to seek large justice eventually, because the marks compound, the interest accumulates, the delays create penalties. The system punishes fighting for justice more than it punishes accepting injustice. That's the lesson the tallies teach. Don't fight, just pay. Keep your record as clean as possible, because the record is what matters. Not truth, not fairness, just what's written down.
Mary understands this too. She's developed strategies for minimizing their family's documentary footprint, avoids conflicts with neighbors that might lead to court, pays obligations promptly, even when payment is difficult, teaches their children to be careful about their behavior because any infraction creates marks that last forever. The family operates under constant awareness that they're being recorded, that Edmund is somewhere making notations about their lives, that those notations will outlive them and shape their children's futures and their grandchildren's opportunities. The tallies are inheritance now, not just the land or tools they might pass down, the documentary record, the marks that say who the Carpenter family is according to the court. That's what gets inherited. That's what persists.
William's son is now 23. He's been careful, has minimal marks in Edmund's records, is trying to build life with clean documentation. But he's still William's son. When opportunities arise, when he wants to lease land or marry someone from another family, the first thing people check is the family's documentary history. William's decades of marks, the pattern of non-compliance and debt. Even though the son has been careful, he's marked by association. The family's record is burden he carries. Documentation that predates him shapes opportunities available to him. That's how the system works. It doesn't just mark individuals, it marks families, marks bloodlines, creates hereditary documentation that's almost feudal obligation itself. You inherit your father's name and his tallies, his reputation in the records, his documented history. That history shapes your future, regardless of your own behavior. The marks outlive not just the moment they document, but the people they document, persist across generations as permanent truths about families that no amount of good behavior in the present can fully overcome.
The quiet justice of the tallies is justice that persists, that accumulates, that becomes more powerful than any individual judgment, because it's summation of all judgments. The individual moments are forgotten, the accusations are forgotten, the circumstances are forgotten, but the marks remain. The documentation persists,
and what persists becomes truth, becomes identity, becomes destiny. William wanted his daughter to marry outside the manor. The Tallies prevented it. His son wants opportunities the father never had. The father's Tallies restrict them. The marks made 20 years ago, in contexts nobody remembers, determine present realities that nobody can change. That's the power of documentation. Not that it's dramatic or loud or spectacular, that it's quiet and persistent and unkillable, that it outlives everything, including truth, that it becomes the only truth that matters, because it's the only truth that's written down, and therefore the only truth that lasts.
William is 62 years old when Edmund dies. Edmund has been the manor clerk for 46 years, has documented tens of thousands of transactions, has created permanent record of 3 generations of Westfield's peasants. His death feels like loss of institutional memory. Except the memory doesn't die. The parchment rolls survive. The system for maintaining them survives. Edmund's replacement is a younger clerk named Peter, who's been trained in the same methods. Peter inherits the rolls, inherits the tallies, inherits the entire documentary infrastructure that Edmund built, and that infrastructure continues operating exactly as before, because it doesn't depend on Edmund. It depends on marks that persist regardless of who maintains them.
Peter's first task is inventorying the active tallies, discovering what obligations remain outstanding. He finds that William Carpenter has 1 active tally, 3 pence from a fine incurred 8 months ago. William thought he'd paid this, remembers handing coins to Geoffrey, but Peter's records show the payment was recorded as 2 pence, not 3. 1 penny remains outstanding. William is summoned to court. He argues that he paid 3 pence. Geoffrey confirms receiving 3 pence, but the record shows 2. Peter's notation, made by Edmund before he died, clearly indicates 2 pence received, 1 penny outstanding. The documentation contradicts William's memory and Geoffrey's memory. In that conflict, the documentation wins. The record is what matters. Memory is unreliable. You owe 1 penny according to the marks. Please pay or I'll add interest.
William pays the penny, doesn't fight it, has learned that fighting documentation is futile. The marks are authoritative, more authoritative than anyone's memory, more authoritative than witnesses, more authoritative than the reeve. The tally said he owed. That's sufficient. Truth is what's written. Everything else is just noise. William has spent 40 years learning this lesson, has watched the system operate long enough to understand that the marks are power, and resisting them is pointless. Better to pay 1 penny you don't actually owe than to fight documentation that will outlast you.
Peter represents new generation of clerks, more systematic than Edmund, more conscious of documentation as power. Edmund created records because that was his job. Peter maintains records because he understands they control the manor. He starts cross-referencing court rolls with tax records, with labour service records, with land tenure records, creating comprehensive documentary network that tracks every aspect of peasant life. The tallies were just one piece. Now Peter is building complete picture. Every transaction, every obligation, every relationship, all documented in marks that connect to other marks, that create a web of evidence about everyone. The manor becomes visible through Peter's records in ways it never was before. The documentation creates transparency that serves authorities' interests by making peasant life completely legible to power.
William watches this expansion with resignation, knows his entire life is now recorded somewhere in Peter's systematic notation. His age, his family, his land, his labour obligations, his tax liability,
his debt history, his court appearances, his character as assessed through accumulated marks. Peter could reconstruct William's biography from the records, could tell a story about William that's based entirely on documentation without ever meeting him. That story would be accurate in some ways, would show the patterns, the occasional compliance problems, the debt accumulations, but would miss everything human, everything about circumstances or intentions or growth or change, would just show marks, cold notations about obligations fulfilled or not fulfilled. That's who William is according to the Manor's records, a collection of marks that persist after everything else is forgotten.
William's grandson is now 12 years old. The boy will inherit the family's land when William dies, will also inherit the family's documentary history. Peter is already making marks about the boy, notations about his parentage, his status, his potential obligations. The boy is being recorded before he's old enough to understand what that means. His life is being documented while he's still living it. The marks are predicting his future based on his family's past, based on patterns that Peter sees in the rolls. The Carpenter family has history of minor non-compliance. The grandson will be watched more carefully because of that history, will be judged against marks made before he was born, will carry documentary burden he didn't create and can't escape. That's the true power of the Tallies. They don't just record the past, they shape the future by creating expectations based on recorded patterns.
William tries to warn the boy, explains how the system works, how important it is to avoid creating marks, how any infraction goes in the records permanently, how those records will be consulted 50 years from now by people who don't know you except through what's written. The boy doesn't fully understand. He's 12. The concept of documentation outliving truth is too abstract. He just knows his grandfather is worried about something involving marks in wood and writing on parchment. He'll understand later, when he's older, when he faces his first court appearance and realizes that Peter already has opinions about him based on records from before he was born, when he discovers that his grandfather's marks created expectations he has to overcome. That's when the lesson will become real.
Thank you for staying with me through this exploration of how documentation creates power that outlives everything else. If this changed how you think about records, about how bureaucracy shapes reality, about the way systems remember while people forget, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your reflections. What modern systems operate like these tallies? Where do you see records creating truths that supersede lived reality? I'm genuinely curious about your experiences with documentation that defines you in ways that feel inaccurate but are impossible to change.
William dies in 1372 at age 64. His death is recorded in Peter's rolls. Date, cause, property transferred to heirs, outstanding obligations at time of death, none currently, which is notable enough that Peter makes special mark indicating the rarity of dying with clean record. William's life is summarized in Peter's notations, 46 years of documentation condensed into final entry that closes the account. But the accumulated marks remain, the history of court appearances, the pattern of obligations, the character assessment built from decades of minor infractions and eventual compliances. That documented history doesn't die with William. It persists as evidence of what the Carpenter family is, what they can be trusted with, what risks they represent. William's marks outlive William. That was always their purpose, to persist, to remember when humans forget, to create permanent truth from temporary moments.
William's son inherits everything: the land, the tools, the documentary history.
Peter updates the records, transfers the burden of the family's documented past to the next generation. The son is now 40, has been carefully maintaining clean record his entire adult life, but he inherits his father's documentation. That history shapes how Peter sees him, how Geoffrey sees him, how the Manor's authorities assess his reliability. He's judged partly by his own marks, but also by the accumulated marks of the family. The Tallies are multi-generational now, creating dynasties of documentation. Some families have clean records passed down through generations. Others have problematic records that mark them permanently as unreliable. The Carpenter family falls in between. Not terrible, not exemplary, just human. But just human, when documented across decades, looks like pattern of problems, looks like family that needs watching. That perception shapes opportunities available to William's descendants, long after William is dead and buried and forgotten by everyone except the records.
The system continues evolving. Peter introduces innovations, starts using Arabic numerals instead of Roman numerals for easier calculation, develops cross-referencing system that links related entries, creates indices that allow quick retrieval of information about any peasant. The documentation becomes more sophisticated, more powerful, more comprehensive. By 1380, Peter can answer almost any question about the manor's past 40 years by consulting his carefully maintained records. Who owed what in 1365? Check the rolls. What was the pattern of complaints against the Miller family? Consult the court entries. Which families have clean records and which don't? Review the accumulated notations. The documentation has created institutional memory that's more reliable than any individual's memory, more accessible than oral history, more authoritative than tradition. The marks are the manor's history now, written in ink and carved in wood, persistent and unchangeable, and powerful beyond any individual's ability to challenge. Other manors adopt similar systems. Word spreads about Westfield's comprehensive record-keeping, about how Peter's documentation enables effective administration. Other clerks visit to learn the methods, return to their own manors with ideas for improving documentation. The tally system expands, becomes more standardized, more interconnected across manors. By the late 14th century, most English manors maintain similar records. The documentation has become infrastructure, foundation of how manorial authority operates, not through personal power or charisma or memory, but through systematic recording that creates permanent obligations and enables consistent enforcement.
The peasants adapt to living under documentary surveillance. Everyone knows they're being recorded. Everyone knows their actions create marks that persist. That awareness shapes behavior, makes people more careful, more compliant, less willing to challenge authority that has permanent record of every challenge, less willing to risk accumulating marks that will follow them forever. The documentation is social control, not through violence or coercion directly, but through creating a system where everything is recorded, and those records are consulted, and those consultations shape opportunities and obligations forever. It's elegant, it's effective, it's quiet. Nobody's being beaten or imprisoned or publicly humiliated. They're just being marked, and those marks are sufficient to maintain order because people learn that marks matter more than truth or justice or any temporary reality.
By 1400, nobody remembers why specific tallies were created. Peter is maintaining records made 50 years ago by Edmund, who's been dead for 26 years. The original circumstances are lost. The original witnesses are dead. But the marks remain, continue being consulted, continue shaping present based on past that nobody remembers except through documentation. The tallies have achieved their purpose. They've outlived everything. They've become the only truth that matters, because they're the only truth that was preserved.
William's pig damage fine from 1348 is just mark in old parchment now. Nobody remembers the pigs. Nobody remembers the field. Nobody remembers the argument, or the witnesses, or the circumstances. But the mark exists, and if anyone wanted to research the Carpenter family history, that mark would be found, would be interpreted as evidence of something, would contribute to assessment of family character based on events nobody remembers but everyone can see documented.
The tallies start being used in new ways, as evidence in disputes about hereditary obligations, as proof of family history when marriages are negotiated, as documentation for tax assessments, as records that establish precedent for how similar cases should be handled. The marks made for immediate purposes of recording debts become source material for understanding the past, for making decisions about the present, for predicting the future. The documentation has transcended its original purpose, has become historical record, source of authority, evidence that can be consulted to settle any question about who owes what to whom and why, and since when. The tallies were created as administrative tools. They've become power itself, the power to define truth, the power to shape identity, the power to determine what's possible for people based on what's documented about their past.
Modern historians examining medieval court rolls are often amazed by their comprehensiveness, by how much detail was recorded, by how carefully marks were maintained. They see this as evidence of medieval bureaucratic sophistication, of administrative capacity that rivaled later periods. All true. But what historians sometimes miss is what that documentation meant for people being documented, how it felt to have your life recorded in marks you couldn't read, how it felt to be judged by records you couldn't access or challenge, how it felt to know that your mistakes would outlive you, would shape your children's opportunities, would become permanent truth regardless of whether they represented complete or accurate picture of who you were. The tallies are administrative achievement from historical perspective. They were existential burden from the perspective of people living under them.
William never fully understood the system he lived under, understood pieces of it, understood that records mattered, understood that documentation outlived memory, but didn't grasp the full scope, didn't see how the marks would persist for centuries, how they'd be consulted by people in the 1400s trying to understand the 1300s, how they'd become historical evidence about his life, even though they only documented tiny pieces of it, filtered through court system that cared about obligations, not humanity. William is dead and largely forgotten, but his marks persist, in archives now, in libraries, on parchment that's been preserved for 600 years. Scholars can read about William Carpenter, can see his court appearances, can track his debts, can assess his character based on accumulated documentation. They don't know William, just know his marks, and those marks are all that remain, are his only immortality. Not grand or glorious, just notations in clerk's careful hand, recording fines from pig damage and ditch maintenance. That's what outlived him. That's what persists. That's what the tallies reveal about who William was, according to the only version of him that survived.
The quiet justice of manorial court tallies is justice that operates through persistence, through recording moments in marks that outlive the moments, through creating obligations that survive memory of why they exist, through building patterns from accumulated documentation that becomes more authoritative than any individual truth. The loudest accusations fade, the most passionate arguments are forgotten, the witnesses die, the circumstances change, but the tallies remain, the marks persist, the documentation outlives everything and becomes the only truth that matters, because it's the only truth that can be consulted centuries later. That's the power of record-keeping. Not that it's just or fair or accurate, that it persists.
that it creates a permanent version of reality that supersedes temporary reality, that it makes what's written more real than what's lived.
Everyday survival under tally systems meant learning to minimize your marks, pay quickly, stay out of court when possible, accept small injustices rather than fighting them, because fighting created more documentation than submitting. Build reputation not through who you actually were, but through managing your documentary profile. Be careful about everything, because everything might be recorded, and anything recorded would persist forever and shape opportunities for you and your descendants across generations. The tallies taught people that records mattered more than character, that documentation mattered more than reputation among those who knew you, that what was written outlived what was true. That's survival strategy, not resisting the system, but learning to navigate it, learning to live under documentary surveillance that never forgot and never forgave, and never stopped accumulating evidence that would be used against you whenever authority needed justification.
The habits developed under tally systems persist long after the systems themselves evolved. The carefulness about documentation, the awareness that records matter, the understanding that what's written down has power separate from truth. Medieval peasants learned these lessons through tallies. Modern people learn them through credit reports and criminal records and employment histories and digital footprints that persist forever in databases that are consulted by people who never meet you but make decisions about your life based on marks they see. The mechanisms change, the technology advances, but the principle remains identical. Documentation creates a permanent version of you that matters more than actual you. Records outlive truth. Marks persist after memory fades. What's written becomes what's real, regardless of whether it's accurate or fair or just. That's the legacy of the tallies, not the specific wooden sticks or parchment rolls. The demonstration that documentation is power, that record-keeping is social control, that persistence is more powerful than any temporary fact or argument or accusation.
The manorial court tallies and archives today are artifacts, historical objects that scholars study to understand medieval administration, but they were lived experience for William and thousands like him, were daily reality of knowing you're being marked, of understanding that those marks would outlive you, of trying to minimize your documentary footprint while accepting that complete avoidance was impossible because the system recorded everything. The tallies weren't neutral, weren't objective, were created by clerks who made subjective judgments about what to record and how to record it. But once recorded, they became authoritative, became evidence, became truth that could be consulted and relied upon and used as basis for decisions long after everyone involved was dead. That's how documentation works. Creates authority through persistence, creates truth through recording, creates power through outliving everything else.
William's story is ultimately about how impossible it is to escape your records, how documentation follows you, how marks made decades ago determine present opportunities, how the system of recording creates obligations that persist beyond any individual's memory or understanding. He tried to be careful, tried to minimize his marks, tried to pay quickly and avoid court, but the accumulation happened anyway. Some marks from legitimate judgments, some from compromises that were neither fair nor unfair, some from circumstances he couldn't control, all permanent, all consulted, all shaping how he was seen by authorities who had more access to his documented history than to his actual character. He died with clean record at the end. Peter made special note of that. But it didn't erase the 40 years of marks that preceded it, didn't change the pattern, didn't alter the documentary truth about the Carpenter family that persisted after William was gone. The tallies won, outlived him, became his only legacy, except for descendants who inherited those marks along with his name.
The quiet justice of the Tallies reveals that justice is often just documentation, not fair outcomes or right judgments, just recording what happened, or what authorities say happened, and making those records permanent, and consulting them forever, as if they represent complete truth, rather than narrow slice of reality, filtered through system that cared about obligations, not context. The Tallies outlived the loudest accusations, because accusations are temporary, sound waves that dissipate, memory that fades. But marks in wood and ink on parchment are permanent, are consultable, are authoritative. The system understood this, built power structure on it, created justice that operated through persistence rather than fairness, through documentation rather than truth, through marks that outlived everything, including the people they marked. That's the pattern. That's the legacy. That's what survives in archives and modern record-keeping systems that work identically despite technological advances. The principle remains. Documentation is power. Persistence is control. Records outlive accusations and arguments and truths and people. The tallies are gone, but their logic persists. Write it down, and it becomes real. Make marks that don't fade, and they become more authoritative than anything someone can say. Create permanent records, and you create permanent truths, regardless of whether those truths are accurate or complete or just. That's quiet justice, justice that works through outloon everything else, through being written when everything else is temporary, through marks that persist when memory fails, and witnesses die, and circumstances change, and everyone forgets, except the records, which never forget and never will, because they're permanent, and permanence is the ultimate power in systems built on time and memory and human fallibility. The Tallies understood that, exploited it, became infrastructure of power through simple act of recording and preserving and consulting.
Forever. That's what William learned across 40 years of living under them. That's what his grandson inherited along with his name and land. That's what persists 600 years later in archives, where William's marks can still be read by people who know nothing about him except what those marks say. The Tallies outlived the loudest accusations and everything else too. That was always their purpose. That's how they worked. That's what they reveal about quiet justice and everyday survival under systems where documentation matters more than truth, and persistence matters more than justice, and what's written down becomes the only thing that's real, because it's the only thing that lasts.